We'll get right into it, and our second last speaker is Patrick Hayes. Open source, what is it, and where is it going?
Hello. So I'm here to talk about open source. This guy is called the GNU, and he is the unofficial mascot of the open source movement. So open source, almost all of you have actually used open source software. If you've ever used Firefox, you've used open source. If you use a Mac, you've used open source. If you use an Android phone, that's an open source system. And if you've ever done a search on Google, all of Google's servers run Linux, which is open source. Open source software has also been to Mars. The Mars rovers, Spirit and Opportunities run open source code as part of their components. So when we talk about open source, we also often use the term free software. And so there's two ways you could think about the word free. The first one is if I said, here's some free beer, you would know exactly what I was talking about. And open source software is free in this first way of thinking about freedom, in that it doesn't cost anything to download and use. But there's a second way that we can use the word free, and that's this kind of free, which means freedom. And this is actually the more fundamental way that when people talk about free software, really at the heart of it, they're talking about software freedom. And what this really means is that open source software is software that you can download for free, you can give away for free, you can change it to do anything you want with it. So there's no licensing that says what you can and cannot do with the software. So the only rules that exist around open source software are rules that are there to guarantee that you give the same freedom to others that others have given to you. So if we have all this open source software out there, how is it that you can go ahead and download this free software and use it and not pay any money for it? Because all we know is that this isn't created by people sitting in their basements doing stuff for the good of the world. There's a lot of people, myself included, who make their living and make good money developing open source software.
It's like a puppy.
So there's basically two ways that businesses make money doing open source software. There's kind of the method that small companies, like my company, does, and then there's the method that larger companies do. And the way that I make my money is we take a piece of open source software that almost fits my client's needs. It might, do 80 or 90% of what they need it to do, except there's that last 10 to 20% that doesn't quite fit exactly what they need the software to do. So what they do is that my client pays us to improve the open source software, and we improve it to fit their needs exactly, so that we deliver to them a piece of software that does exactly what they need it to do, and we take those improvements that we've done to the software, and then we give it back to the community so everybody else in the world can use our improved software for free. So that's how I make my living. I make my living building stuff that I then get to give away. So the way that that didn't really turn out very well. The way that larger companies make money doing open source software development is they give the software away for free under an open source license, but then they make their money with a suite of services around that software. So they give it away for free, but then you can't really read this, they do support work, they do training, they do integration work, certification, and a whole bunch of other services. So basically, the other way you can make money with open source software is to give your main bit away for free, but then charge for all the services that surround it. So, open source software, there's been an argument going on about whether open source software will actually be successful. And according to The Economist, as of last year, The Economist said open source has won the argument, meaning it is possible to build viable business doing open source and giving your work away for free. However, this isn't the whole story, because not only has open source won the argument in saying it's viable to do open source is growing at 3 times the rate as proprietary software, which means that not only is open source surviving, it's winning. So how is that possible? How is it that software that people give away for free is beating out software that people are charging for and people are putting a lot of energy into? And the reason why open source software seems to be, this is kind of the current in vogue theory about why open source software is beating proprietary software in the marketplace, is that proprietary software can be, let's call it promiscuous, in ways that, open source software can be promiscuous in ways that proprietary software can't. And let me try to explain this. A piece of software that's developed by a single company, it has this kind of relationship to its parent company that created it. So it might be a great piece of software that does amazing things, but if the company is mismanaged, or is having financial troubles unrelated to the software, or is doing all sorts of other things could happen to that company that could affect the development and the survival rate of that software. So the software and the company are deeply bound, and their fate is deeply bound. However, open source software is a bit different, because open source software, although it's usually created by one individual or a group of individuals or one company, it can actually have relationships with all sorts of other companies and all sorts of other developers. And what this really, really means is that the success of open source software isn't bound to the market. A single company can fail, and the software can continue to get the love and devotion that it needs to thrive as a viable piece of software. So, for example, in my work, I developed a piece of open source mapping software, which was then basically my mapping software cheated on me with a development firm in Washington, D.C., who started developing it and improving it and using it in all sorts of their projects. While I kind of lost control of the project a little bit, ultimately the software ended up being far superior because of all the work and devotion they put in to that piece of software. So while it's a little bit emotionally challenging for me, being in an open relationship with my software, it's actually a lot better for the software itself. So open source, the open source movement, while it started in the software world, it slowly started building out into different places. So this here is an open source car where all the engineering plans and the technical design elements for the car are released under an open source license. This is Nine Inch Nails, the industrial rock band, which you guys all hopefully love, Trent Reznor. Since he's released all his most recent albums under an open source permissive license and given away all the production files for free so people can download it and remix it. This is open source architecture. This is a building whose plans and design are released under open source licensing, and this is a school in Africa. And most importantly, this is open source beer, where the recipe for the beer is released under an open source license, allowing anybody to grab that recipe and use it for any reason. So that's kind of where we are right now. Open source software, open source movement is hugely successful in software, and it's starting to get into other areas of the economy. So what about the future? So looking 50 years into the future, what is the role that open source software might play? Or not just open source software, sorry, let me reframe that. Open source movement in general might play. And if there's any history has told us that the history of the past 200 years in terms of how we do work is automation. Is we've seen automation and us going from an industrial society to a knowledge economy, and that's going to obviously continue for the next 50 years, at least. So we're going to go to a situation where the few remaining jobs that look like this will start looking like this. And the jobs that humans need to perform will more and more look like this. Or maybe more realistically, like this. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is that the knowledge economy and the economy of work that can be done according to open source principles is getting larger and larger and larger, becoming a larger component of the economy. So ultimately what this means is that there is the potential, a real potential, that the majority of us, if we do it right, could have jobs where we're getting paid to give our work away for free. And what gets me really excited about this is how incredibly subversive this is. This is an entirely new way of doing market economies, and it's an entirely new way of doing capitalism. And I really see the open source movement as a continuation. Go back. I lost the slide. Yeah. Oh, wait, well, let me go back again. Okay.
It was awesome, it was big, it was red, capitalism 3.0.
Yeah, so I sense it was like enjoy capitalism 3.0. Basically, if you talk to people in the open source movement and ask them why they're doing it, it's really a continuation of the same movement that created trade unionism, the same movement that led to the creation of the welfare state. It's a continuation of trying to take the market economy, which we use to organize our lives, and make it more responsible and more caring for the people in it, and hopefully more equitable. So ultimately, open source software and the open source movement in general is about taking the means of production and what we spend our time doing, and taking it out of the realm of control and ownership, and bringing it into the realm of community, shared resources, shared effort, and freedom. That's it. Thank you.